Hey friends! So for as long as I can remember, I've loved having conversations with people that are either experts in their field or where I'm a bit of an expert, and I really like digging deep into subjects and just having conversations about it, learning new things, and really challenging the ideas that I hold deeply. And so for that reason, I'm proud to announce that I'm finally going to be having a podcast where I'm going to be recording these conversations with my friends, with experts in fields that I find interesting. The topics that I want to really focus on in this podcast are like three legs to a stool. The stool being a wholesome, well-rounded lifestyle. The three legs of this stool being health, wealth, and happiness. I'm going to record conversations with people that are experts in fields that are related to those three topics and really dig deep into the ideas, have conversations, and really just enjoy time with people that I might not be able to get into contact with in other contexts, outside of the context of a podcast. So to kick off this podcast with a bang, I figured I'd bring on an expert in something that's pretty relevant to what's going on right now, the pandemic, quarantine, COVID-19. And we're going to talk about a bunch of different things, and although we couldn't squeeze everything I wanted to discuss into this podcast because of time constraints, and there were a few technical glitches, you'll see video and audio, but I really wanted to get this out there. I didn't want to wait any longer, so I'm excited to present to you guys the first episode. I'm so glad that you were able to join me on my first podcast. You're a bit of an expert in viruses and a bunch of other cool stuff that you've explained to me in the past, and I'd love for you to share it with the wider internet through this podcast. And it's very contextual to this time because of the big thing that's going on, right? The thing that
apocalypse, it's fine.
Yeah, the casual apocalypse that's
minor
going on.
detail.
So can you just give a LinkedIn bio, if you will, of who you are and why it might make sense that you're on this podcast sharing your knowledge?
This is the moment that my PI has been training me for 4 years now. So I'm a PhD student at Cornell University, and I'm not necessarily a virus expert because there's a lot of different viruses that exist. Some of them can infect only very specific things, and others have a broader host range. So the difference between what I work on and the apocalypse is that COVID-19, the virus that causes it, is actually a eukaryotic cell type, like humans, animals, virus. And I actually work engineering prokaryotic, so bacteria-specific viruses. And I engineer them to serve as biosensors for food and water safety in developing countries. Well, not just me, everybody else who works with me.
Right. Okay. So like there's two categories, and you're in one category, and the current situation with coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 is the other category. So I guess that moves into my first question is, you work in a lab, and I believe you said in the past that you're a level 2 lab, right?
BSL level 2, yeah, we are able to handle those organisms.
So which organisms are those? Like, do any come to mind that somebody might know if they were listening?
So like Listeria Monocytogenes, that's a really dangerous food pathogen. About 1 in 6 people end up getting sick when they, with a really serious illness when they consume it. With beef, you might think of E. coli 0157H7. So these are things that can cause some pretty serious diseases if you consume it, but it's not like anthrax or like Ebola and rabies, and all these really intense, life-threatening organisms would be BSL level 4 or 3 and up there.
Okay, so you're definitely not at the same level as like...
No, but I have worked in those labs before. I worked at Cornell Animal Health Diagnostic Center, and so we had a rabies vector species room that only our director was allowed to go into because it's just so dangerous. So
right. Okay. Yeah. Well, speaking of the danger, we'll loop back into that later because I have a question that might be interesting. But so right now we've got a lot of numbers out there, and like I'm not a numbers expert. My expertise is more in marketing and business and stuff like that. But what you do a lot of is reading research, right? and understanding like the numbers and what research is valid and what research isn't valid. That's correct?
Yeah,
Yeah, so
blurry line sometimes.
well, yeah, that's what's really interesting though, is because recently on the Joe Rogan podcast, um, Elon Musk was discussing how we have a problem of numbers right now. We don't know what's real data, what's not so real data, like what's accurate and what is being characterized as accurate when it's really just there's a bunch of gray area, right? It's
Mhm.
not everything's black and white. So I guess I was wondering, where do you stand on like trusting action items out of the numbers that we have right now, or do you think like
Meaning
Elon
that
that
if they say these numbers usually lead to X.
yeah, like I guess in that we've seen that the numbers were like, oh, this is significantly worse than the flu, because I just looked it up. The mortality rate, if you do go by strict deaths to
Hmm.
confirmed cases,
Hmm.
globally speaking, is about 9%.
Hmm.
But then we know from the reports that are out there, like it gets a little bit muddier. Like we know that some areas are underreporting, some areas were
Right.
overreporting. Like we know
And then there's
Germany.
also a definition issue as well.
Well, yeah,
So,
that was the
what
other
you
issue.
call serious and I call serious could be really different. And so you get underreporting or overreporting.
Right. So, like, I guess when you look for a number out there on the internet, or in a report, how do you have faith that that number is real? Is it like confirmation from other sources, or is it just the source of that information being verifiable?
It's actually a conglomerate of all those things. I think that it's really dangerous to approach believing knowledge that's out there when it's only you coming from a single source. That's why even in any of the arguments that are out there, you really should look at both sides. So, for example, let's like talk about the face cloth covering. Some people say, well, that's useless.
Okay.
It's not really helping anyone. But in
Mhm.
reality, it's well, sure, and N95 mask might be more effective, but we need those for it's such short supply. We desperately need those for the people that are right in the forefront. So I see your point. It's technically true, but it's keeping it in people's minds. It's
Mhm.
also if you're asymptomatic and you don't know, and you go out for 5 minutes, and in that 5 minutes you get 5 people sick, and if you just left it on, maybe for 10 minutes it'd be useless, but those 5 minutes it was useful. So it
Right.
just
Okay.
becomes this situational issue. So when I approach numbers or facts or anything like that, numbers are especially tricky because mathematical models are fluctuating and they're
Mhm.
fluid. And because of that dynamic aspect of their models, by the time you hear the estimate, it's already changed. So whether
Right.
it's
Yeah.
higher or lower, it can change both ways.
Right. So, like, for example, the model of U.S. deaths originally was forecasted at, I think it was 250,000, 250,000
Hmm.
deaths. And then that got adjusted. And it's been since adjusted down to, I believe it's above 50,000, but below 100,000 is the current number that they've settled on. I don't know exactly where it is right now,
I don't think they do
updated as
either.
of May 10th. But the point stands that like that's a huge variance from what they initially forecasted, and it's just because, correct me if I'm wrong, it's they're able to hone in their data and they had a bandwidth that was this, so they gave us the scary number in order to get us to act on certain things.
Mm.
And because if we gave them the lower end of the spectrum, people would say, hey, that's not worth shutting down the economy, that's not worth changing my
Yeah,
behavior over. But
right.
then it's really somewhere in there, and it turns out it was nicely in the middle, because we did all these action items like masks, social distancing, and like shutting down the
Yeah,
economy.
and that actually has a phenomena has a title to it. It's called the prevention paradox. It's what's happening in Germany right now, for example, which is Germany saw what was happening and they locked down things and shut down their economy so quickly that the number of cases that they were dealing with were pretty low.
Okay.
So then it became I'm not seeing what you're saying is the problem, government. And so the people stopped believing, and therefore they stopped taking the precautions, and they're starting to see this uptick in cases. So I think that for the United States numbers, in my personal opinion,
Yes.
this is an opinion-based thing at this point, is that our testing is not sensitive and accurate enough for those numbers to really be trusted. Plus, we do not have wide enough dispersal of tests. So there's another deficit in your reporting.
Okay.
And right now, because of the political climate that we have in the United States and it being so torn, not because of any one party, it's takes two to tango. But it is hard to, I think information is being hoarded as much as rice and beans are. So it's a really, and it's moving so quickly. The viruses move so quickly that especially because when they're hitting one area, if there's not a lot of travel from it to another, you could keep it contained. Having too many moving parts makes it very difficult, and the United States is notoriously known for being 50 unique states. So
Right.
it's hard to govern it as one populace a lot of the time.
Right. Yeah. So speaking of, I guess, like the numbers, like I have a report that I was looking at about how it's from biospace.com. So I believe there's some credibility there. And they're referencing a lot of studies about how the infection rate is actually 16 and a half times higher based off of some sampling that they've done. I just want to have it in front of me. Basically, they were sampling, this was a Stanford University study where they sampled 3,300 people in Santa Clara, California, and they were seeing that the number of people that was actually tested positive in the official totals was significantly lower than when they went out and sampled random people as having the antibodies. And so, like, to that end, now we have like the numerator denominator problem. I don't know if it's being shared enough, but this is my understanding, and I'm sure you know it a little bit better. But if you have the numerator is the deaths and the denominator is the total cases, then you get your percent fatality rate. And if the numerator is drastically lower than it needs to be because people are saying, hey, I'm asymptomatic, I'm not going to go and get tested. Now your numerator is nice and small, meaning the fatality rate.
Sample size issues.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So if it's in fact 16 and a half times higher, let's use global numbers because I know those off the top of my head. We're at 4.1 million.
Of course.
That's a huge number. 60 million people having it, according to this report. I mean, this is like an aggregate, but
which means I would take those numbers and then assume there's more of cases
of the 4 million.
And we're talking globally. If you say how many cases are there, everyone's getting sick little by little, and so those numbers I think are still on the rise because we haven't quite oriented to take control. We're almost there.
Right. But if you've got 16, if you've got 4 million confirmed, but it's 16 and a half times bigger, that's roughly 60 million. Let's say, let's be a little bit conservative by rounding down for quick mental math. 60 million. That means the fatality rate, which we know those numbers are a little bit muddy based on, or I believe, and I'm convinced that they're a little bit muddy because of the way they're telling medical examiners to report fatalities. They die. There was a kid that died in a car crash and he was reported as a COVID death. So like we know the numbers aren't 100%
definition.
But like let's assume that they're a little bit optimistic, being a higher number than actually the true number. Then that percentage fatality rate goes way down, right?
So, okay, I'm following. So you're asking, does it?
Well,
in principle, it
just
would.
In terms of straight math, right?
Right. But so it becomes, as you said, a definition problem of how many cases and what mortality is constituted as, and whether or not you can trust the government that's reporting the numbers. And
our good communist friends.
Well, yeah, I mean, they admit it.
Yes.
So, but yeah, I think that it becomes difficult, and like I said, it's a dynamic number, and so the mortality and what that means can be really different. The other thing is that some diseases are cause and effect, where you will get sick with this agent, it'll cause this specific disease, you will recover or you won't. Sure. But with COVID-19 and well, let's just stick with COVID-19, you
Mhm.
run the risk of the talk about if you have heart disease, if you have asthma, if you are immunocompromised in any way, you can have, you're more susceptible to COVID. So then it warps it because you have this extra driving force and element behind why you get sick. But if we say that 95% of the population is not immunocompromised in such a way, which is not an accurate reading, by the way, but we're just going with that
Yeah,
number.
round numbers, nice and easy
Right.
mental math.
So if you're saying that that's the case, then that it's not a concern for, you can make a more accurate model because only 5% of the population would fall outside of it. But for this, it's so muddy. The credibility is it can't be there because it's so hard to pinpoint what's actually happening.
Okay. So, yeah. So, I mean,
What I'm saying is all these estimates are estimates, and they really should be treated that way. I think what the most dangerous thing and the most important thing to drive across is saying that just because it's not happening in your area doesn't mean it can't come there. And
right.
so if people are using these numbers and in their areas to prove that they can relax these social distancing things, when the influenza of 1917 broke out.
Yeah, the Spanish flu, as it's colloquially
Right.
known.
Right. So when they had that outbreak in Philadelphia, they didn't shut down. They had this huge parade and like 20,000 people ended up dying. In St. Louis, on the other hand, however, they were watching the East Coast expand with these cases. And the second that they had a case, they shut down their entire city. And so because of that, by the end of the epidemic, pandemic, they had 50% less death cases than Philadelphia had, for example. So we're seeing this difference of lax versus not. Or in Germany, we're seeing people coming back too early or not being rigorous enough with the restraints, and you're having an uptick of it. So this second wave is huge. And especially now that you have people remembering the trauma of going in and sheltering in place, and it is a trauma. Our brains are not reacting well to this. You're going to have a harder time convincing people to do it, which means you're even higher risks of the people you interact with possibly having been exposed.
Right. So actually, the trauma thing is interesting because that wasn't something that I mentally took too seriously, because I don't get affected kind of by the outside world as much as a lot of people that I'm aware of. I know social media is really interesting in that you can see other people who have widely different perspectives on life. And like one thing that was going around was there was a meme that was like, if you don't come out of the lockdown with like a side hustle that's developed, if you haven't read books, if you haven't been personal developing, then you're not unmotivated, or you're not uninspired, you're unmotivated. And then somebody had like slashed it out and said like, you're going through a collective trauma, and it's totally okay. And like I can see both sides of that, especially when there was something that I had read that recently that was really interesting, that I have the so basically that the suicides, overdoses, and overconsumption of alcohol that are going to happen because of the lockdown, the numbers are so much higher than I thought. And I was like, oh, maybe that little meme is a little bit more true than like, because like I don't like, I've had stomach surgery, you know me, like I've had my surgery on my hip, I had surgery
You've
on my
had a
stomach.
lot of huge things that most people did not have to deal with.
Exactly. And so like it's really interesting to see like, okay, so there's this other side, and the deaths were crazy. Like I'm going to read them off, and just bear in mind, these are huge numbers. So if the economy recovers, we're going to see about 27,000 deaths because of the suicides and overconsumption of alcohol, overdose on like fentanyl and stuff like that. 27,000. And then if it's a slow recovery, so extending over the course of 24 to 36 months, 154,000 deaths. That's
From
like
suicide related, overdose related.
Yeah, self-destructive behaviors, what we can call them that. That's wild. That's double what the current deaths are because of.
It's not all that surprising though, because you have more. So for example, with my with my I had spinal injury.
Mhm.
There were periods of time where I was so distraught over losing certain abilities to do things as a young person that I felt like I would never come back to a true level of happiness or being content or anything. And it's a matter of reframing your perspective. But as you just attested to, you and I have had some significant things that most people haven't had to go through. But there were times I did not handle it well. And I'm sure you had times where you were not okay with it and what
Right.
the loss of control. And so that loss of control not only takes a huge toll on what we want to do in our aspirations and motivation, like think about when you stop eating healthy and then you're like, I don't want to do it again.
Yep.
You lose the train of motivation, but you also end up having this other actual biological shutdown in your brain where your brain thinks it's being isolated, and so it starts to release these like guilt hormones where it's saying like, no, you need to conform with society, you're being left out, which is bad in a social based animal group, which are
Mhm.
humans. So do some, like, you should feel guilty, you should feel like you're doing something because you should be a part of things,
Right.
but we can't be right now. So it's an
Mhm.
impossible problem where our brain keeps feeding us these negative things
Right.
biologically, and then we sink lower and lower, which makes it harder to remember. We don't really do a great job remembering our past. They
Yep.
dissociate from the present. So we don't remember what it was like to be happy, or that everyone's going through this, or that it's only really been 3 months. You've been alive how many months? How many, if you were to
I don't want to do the
calculate
math.
all, right? I know, me too. I'm older than you, so
Yep.
I mean, if you calculate how many, you had a magic ball and you were able to do this, and you looked at all of the months or the date months that
Mhm.
you've been upset,
Yep.
they would probably outweigh, because your memory is going to remember the negative things better. So you're not going to remember the
Yeah, we
positive
have
things as
that
much either.
psychological fallacy
The
where we
bias,
remember
yeah.
bad things. I think the study was like 10 times as much as we remember good things, the risk versus
I
reward.
remember it exactly. But yeah, because I mean, you're going to want to remember where your family member died from a tiger attack versus where you found corn last season.
Yeah,
So
because immediate death is worse than the
just like a
benefit
good
of
tidbit to
having, yeah,
remember.
exactly.
Right. So yeah, so
Yeah,
it's
so
it is staggering to me, and but I don't think that's a good reason to reopen. I
it
think that
is
because it's a
just
huge
because.
number. Yes, it's a huge number, and I feel for the suffering. I mean, your sister, my own wife,
Mhm.
I'd never seen her be upset. Like genuinely, I don't. Why do I feel like why do I feel like this? And I have my own mother. I mean, it's taking a toll on people you'd never really expect
Mhm.
it to. And but I do feel for those people, and I am one of those people suffering because I am part of the human. I'm part of humans in this current time.
Right.
But death, like death for the world again, or another fluctuation of this where let's say governments need to really lock down because people
Mhm.
aren't listening, that would be a totalitarian government. Locking me in my house is way worse to me than being stuck for another 3 months or 2 months or whatever.
Yeah, so we enter this fallacy where we have to accept some level of authoritarianism, if you will, um, in order to avoid authoritarianism, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So in China, there's video leaked, so it's not like, oh, a report of this or a rumor of this, but there were video of uh, police officers welding people in their apartments, and these are
Yeah.
in America we think apartments in the way we think of like college dorms or bigger than college dorms even, but like in China, some of these apartments are really two-bedroom with no windows with a door, and when you
Right.
weld that shut, they literally cannot get out. Like,
Right.
and so once it's welded, you're kind of stuck. So that was happening, and we want to avoid that.
Right.
But
Not
we
that that would be
also,
like the immediate next step for the United States government at that part. They're like, well, let's weld them all in.
well, yeah, but it's tough,
But
right?
I
Because
get your
we got
point.
some,
Yeah.
we have the benefit of like living in a little bit more freer society, but like we have to balance it. But is basically what I'm seeing in the grand scheme of things is we have this first peak, right? And we know we're a little bit past the peak as a country. we're past the first peak.
We know where we think.
That's true.
You'd never last in grad school.
All right. In my opinion, we're past the first peak. But then there's going to be a second peak, and there will be a second peak. It's just a matter of the amplitude of that peak.
Correct.
So is that peak going to be 10% of the initial peak, or is it going to be the same height or bigger because we're going to unlock and people are going to go out and party, right? Like if we let everybody out on in the end of May, like great weather, that's barbecue season, people are going to have people over, all those things. So it's like also they're going to have the behaviors that they wouldn't have otherwise had. I know people are hiking right now at local trails.
People are also being more risky than normal.
Right. So they want to,
because they were kept from it before.
Right. Exactly. So that's the problem. But like the only way I see out of this is juggling it while also letting the science kind of take charge and say, hey, there's some vaccines in the works. I know from a little bit about vaccines that I don't, but there was one cool thing that I just read that's super exciting and I'm super happy about it is an mRNA vaccine that makes the proteins for the spikes on the coronavirus.
And why would you want that?
Because your body doesn't need to react to the core of the virus, the DNA in the core of the virus. It just needs to react to the spikes.
Anything that would be on the surface of the virus.
Right. So the reason why it's exciting is because the company in its official report of this is willing to share it with the Pfizer's, all the biotech companies. They're not trying to develop this for themselves and just keep it to themselves, which is kind of exciting in my opinion.
No, I think so too. And that's actually one of the ways that we do vaccines anyways, is it's called virus or viral display. And it's usually we'll stick it on a different virus that either can't get inside of us or something like that, so that it floats around our body, says, whoa, foreign material. Oh, and by the way, look at this fancy bow tie it's holding. So then it goes around and it takes that piece, it gives it to a part of your adaptive immune system. It goes, gotcha, let me work on something. Makes this antibody that it will now always produce. It will remember that fancy bow tie that it got.
Sure.
And so it releases this huge wave. It takes about like 1 to 3 weeks after that bow tie gets brought over to that B cell to have enough antibodies in your body to actually stop disease by deactivating all viral particles.
Okay.
Assuming they're free floating and not hiding inside of your cells.
Right. That's the difficulty that we thought we would have initially when we were hearing about reports of people getting reinfected or the virus kind of hiding in various parts of the body. Well,
we don't have cases of people getting reinfected. We don't have proof that when you've been infected and have antibodies in your system that you won't be able to get reinfected. But we have yet, as of like April 24th, there has not been any cases that show one way or the other that you're immune after. And that's the other worry, is that let's say you go out, because they're talking about these immunity passports.
Yeah,
and the World Health Organization was like, right, yeah. And so, but the think about the flu virus. Every year it mutates. Even I think more than once a year it mutates. And so we end up having to have a vaccine that goes out that has that's quadrivalent. So it's got 4 different types of flu viruses that it's guessing is coming our way. And there have been some seasons where it doesn't work. But viruses, the way they survive is they mess up a little on purpose, because some of those mess ups they won't continue on, and some of them make them even better than before. And so if it mutates, if our body is looking for the bow tie and the virus mutates so it's now wearing a tie, it's like me going by like this. It's gonna, you can't see me.
You're still the same person, you just look incrementally
but our
different.
body doesn't know that. And so then you end up with this. So if that were to happen, and I'm actually pretty surprised at how it has mutated, but not as extreme as I've seen other viruses mutate. That's surprising to me. And if that were to happen, that peak that you were talking about would be way too high for any health system to handle.
You're talking about
Because
the second peak.
No, well, if the second peak is basically as if it were the first peak, because it's a brand new virus.
Right, okay.
Because you've got the last one that people haven't actually been exposed to, and now the new one.
Right, okay.
If it has a different surface protein, if we're targeting that.
Okay.
Now, the other thing that they're working on is medications that will stop the infection process, so that even if you're wearing a bow tie or a tie, doesn't matter, because if you get inside, your machines don't work. You're speaking another language to the cell, and the cell doesn't understand what it wants you to do. So in conjunction, you need to have these preventative measures and ways of blocking or slowing to give our body enough time to find it on its own and start making a second set of antibodies.
Do you have a drug in mind for stopping those, the production of those?
They released one. I have to go back and find it.
Is it remdesivir, I think is the pronunciation?
I have to go. I have like 1,000 tabs open now.
I'm sure you do,
yeah. I'll go back and I can find it for you. But they talked about this. It's in, everyone's all abuzz like, oh, this is really great. It's a way of kind of throwing a monkey wrench into things.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's the one you're talking about. Yeah. So the company that was working on that is excited because it is it's shown benefits, and it's already been cleared by the FDA for additional trials, and their ability to produce it is tremendous, which is good for us, because we want the cure to be fast, to be effective, to have low side effects, and our ability to produce it to be high, which you're literally looking for, like, the Goldilocks of all these, like, variables, like these 4 variables that they have to juggle, and they have to make them all perfect, and it's like,
that's why we have clinical trials. Normally these vaccines and drugs will take 5 to 10 years to develop because of these 3 stages. Because the polio vaccine in the early 1900s, they sent out, when they did the first batch of it, there were 120,000 people who got the vaccine and were prevented against it. And then there were 40,000 children who were given it who then developed polio because they got a bad batch or their genetics didn't react well with it. And then on top of that, the other children that were in contact with those 40,000 that it didn't work on. So, and that was before we had these 3 clinical stages that are there.
Right.
The other thing we haven't even thought about yet is cross-reactivity with, a lot of people are taking a lot of drugs. I mean, like prescription drugs and probably other drugs at this point.
Oh, I was laughing because I take Humira, so like that's an immunosuppressant. So it makes me, although I've seen some contrasting studies about the TF1 proteins, but basically it's suppressing the whole immune system. So I'm technically more vulnerable than the average person to any virus, but I have this weird thing where, knock on wood, I don't seem to get sick that often, which is really shocking. But what's, just to put it out there, that the mRNA vaccine that I was looking at is 1273, the one that creates the viral proteins. But the polio vaccine is significantly different, whereas instead of working on the outer nubs or the spikes of creating antibodies for the spikes,
no, call them outer nubs. It's way better.
The nubs. But the polio vaccine was deactivated because, like you said, 40,000 got.
But that's the same thing. It's deactivated, but it just means you're giving it the whole outfit instead of just the bow tie.
Right.
To pick which one, and that way you have antibodies against this one or that one. Because when a virus mutates, usually the first thing that it's the most malleable is the surface. Are these receptors, so that it can camouflage better.
Right, but the surface proteins, those spikes, are the most important thing to look at, right? Because that's the furthest out, literally, from a physical standpoint.
Right,
that your body would interact with, right? So earlier you had mentioned there's a bunch of symptoms, which makes it difficult to get those numbers accurate. I guess the overarching theme is how the numbers are not accurate, but we can dig through our own.
Stick with sources. Not awesome.
Not awesome, yeah.
Just not awesome.
So what are your thoughts on, like, some of these weird symptoms? Like
which ones?
The COVID toes.
Oh my God.
The reason why
the COVID toes.
What?
What's COVID toes?
You haven't heard of that? Okay, so the COVID toes.
I don't look up toes a lot, believe it or not.
Yeah, let's the foot fetish joke is out there.
It's too easy.
But it basically looks like frostbite on your extremities, and obviously you move your hands a lot more, so you're less likely to experience it on your hands. But it seems like it's your extremities are getting a significant lack of blood flow, so you get these frostbite-looking symptoms. So like surface blotches that are very similar. It's like very red, and then the center is purple, so it looks like a blister that's deep in the skin. And the reason why I bring it up and the reason why I can accurately describe it is because I had these COVID toe looking things, and I haven't had any of the feelings of this COVID toes thing.
When
But
did you have COVID toes? Also, we gotta
this
find
was
a
like
definition
2
of
weeks
COVID
ago.
toes.
But my point being is that it's a weird symptom that like doesn't map with other things, but it also kind of does, right? Like we know,
Yeah, if we talk
hey,
about all encompassing, oh, you're gonna have blood flow issues, but in your
that's the one,
toes versus on
right?
your arm, yeah.
Well, because you've got these little blood vessels in your toes and your fingers, and like,
hmm
oh, it seems to go away when you move the toes
They're less
vigorously.
tolerant.
Right. So it's very interesting. It's like, but nobody I've been like living with has had any other symptoms other than like the sniffly nose. So it's like, well, that's what happens when you go out hiking in the cold. Um, so it's like, it's curious. Is like,
Not that anyone in your household has had COVID. You're more saying that, or you don't technically know, you haven't been tested, but
well, yeah.
you
So that's
mean
the
more
issue is
that.
if we had one of those like quick tests, we'd at
Mm-hmm.
least have a potentially false positive or negative, but we'd have a test that
Mm-hmm.
could represent the whole household. That's another thing that I've been thinking about is could we test an individual, like the head of household, the hub
Mm-hmm.
of the household? So in
The one who moves
a
around the
household with
most, you
children.
mean?
Sorry?
The one who moves around the most, like leaves or goes to this, like
Exactly.
your
'Cause,
mom, for example, would
yeah,
be.
my mom would be a perfect example. Is if she got tested and it was positive, we know for a fact all of us have been exposed to the point where we would have gotten it.
Right,
If
contact
I got
tracing.
tested, maybe, but maybe not because I haven't gone shopping or anything like that.
And you've been hiding in your room working on a podcast, so.
Yeah,
So
little
like
things.
you've been self-isolating.
Self-isolated like you
Slides
wouldn't
food
believe.
under the door.
Yeah, but like other than that, like would that work? Is that something that's outlandish? Because the average household is what, 4 people, 5 people?
Right, yeah, well,
So we could
again, the work for what?
work to rapidly deploy large amounts of testing instead of having, hey, get your whole
You mean
family in a car.
yes, it would be a smarter, it would be if we only had the resources that we had now, then yeah, I think that's a really good idea actually, that you would, I mean, it's arbitrary of like who, so maybe I go to 10 places. I go to this 9 deserted streets and 1 deserted park. And let's say you and I were living in the same space, you go to a dog grooming shop where there's 5 people in there and then 3 deserted streets. I've been to more places than you, but you were exposed to more people. So it
Right.
becomes this, well, is it more destinations? What an interpretation thing again. But
Yeah, I mean,
assuming they can simplify it,
I think
I think
people
it's a
are
good idea.
operating at a level where they could understand. Choose the person in your household most likely to be exposed. I mean, maybe it's the
Yeah.
teenager that the kid, like for example, my neighbors,
Sneaking
they've
out all the
definitely been
time.
hanging out with other people
Yeah.
that like the spider web is a lot bigger because
Right.
they've been with
Higher
other
risk and
people.
probability of, yeah.
Right. Versus like their parents, even if they've gone shopping, they're cognizant of certain behaviors, washing hands and stuff that I know
Mm.
my neighbors wouldn't have been doing. So like would that map to reality, and like why might we not have heard that as a proposed solution for using potentially a quarter of the amount of total test kits to cover 4 times as many people?
So I think that it is, remember the sample size problem you talked about earlier?
Hmm.
So when the less people that you have, the more that bias and skewing of the data happens. And so if we already are saying only 60% of these tests would actually be truly correct, and you give it to only the head honcho of all the households, then that number is less impressive. It keeps going down and becoming less of a clear picture of the true situation.
Okay.
So I think if in a perfect world we had a highly accurate and specific test than we have now, which we do not have, as I understand it, anywhere. They all have these really big deficits because it's just recently happened.
Right. Yeah, they're rapid deployment tests that.
Right. This is what happens.
They're
You
close.
lose quality when you go to quantity or speed.
Sure. Yep.
But I think that I lost my train of thought here. It would, if we had that more accurate test, I think that it would be okay it would be more acceptable to give it to distribute what we have, the little that we have everywhere. But we have such low accuracy that wouldn't be a great idea because of what they think is going to happen after people get results.
Right. So you're
They
basically
think,
saying,
oh, I'm fine, therefore I'll go out.
I've heard 70% failure rate of these tests, false negative. Meaning that if we give it to the wider population, we'll create this really watered down denominator where the denominator now is going to swell to be potentially 3 times as large as it should really be, because 70% failure rate. That would be worst case scenario. And then we would show, hey, unlock the country. This is a ridiculous thing to be locking down our economy, having.
It would be harder to justify people staying home.
Yep.
Yeah. And we don't know if people who have already been infected and have antibodies in their system are protected, or if they are, for how long. We don't know if the virus has mutated somewhere. We don't know if getting a vaccine could cause a whole, I don't think getting a vaccine would cause a whole new wave of any problems, but it's a whole new ball game where cross reactivity with drugs and whatever. So we don't know so many things. That think about how desperate people are. Think about how angry people are. They're going to just, all their selective hearing. You aren't sick. Great, let's go out. You already had it. Great, let's go out. But what happens if you get the next version of COVID?
True. So that actually, there's something interesting. So
I don't. Why do you smile like that? You always think you're like.
Well, it's because I have the next idea in my head.
Okay.
Also, I have such a charming smile that it shows on camera
is.
really well.
Yeah, it worked for me too.
But
Not from you.
There's hydrochloroquine, which was really popular because our good friend Trump, and I'm saying that as a joke, he popularized it in one of his press conferences where he said that there's this drug, hydrochloroquine, and it's showing a great promise. And then there was a woman who tried it. So this false hope was created. But then what happened was the media blew up over the fact that she was hospitalized, and then her husband died because of this cure that was proposed. And then it
wasn't proposed. I think it was more like he was spitballing ideas, because if I'm in front of a bunch of lights and people are asking me about something that's rapidly developing, I'd probably be like, let me think off the top of my head.
Right. So the issue, though, that I found is it goes back to reporting and data and things that everything needs to move really fast, and we have to have accurate data, but we can't have both speed and accuracy. So we're going to trade that off. But the thing is that they didn't even take hydrochloroquine. They took, I think it was chloroquine phosphate, which is a completely different thing. So what happened, though, that was very quick, was the media ran with this story, meaning that there were a lot of doctors that were actually using it in the off-label. So the FDA approved its off-label usage, and then a lot of doctors were hesitant to use it in its off-label usage because of the popularity of these stories, specifically the one that the husband died and the woman was hospitalized. So if you were a COVID patient and you'd been watching CNN or whatever popular news site, and you saw this on television because you're stuck in the hospital,
because you're afraid,
and then your doctor comes in and says, "Hey, we are now approved to use hydrochloroquine," and then you say, "Ooh, I don't know," and he's like, "Well, we have no other options. It's either you're gonna die or you're gonna take it." And then your option is, "Hey, it's either in your mind, it's I'm gonna die or I'm gonna die. I'm gonna be poisoned by this." So my question to you, I guess, is when we run too fast, do you think that we should slow down the media to speed up, to allow science to kind of take charge? Because I feel like the media is taking charge instead of science.
I don't. So you know what, the media is what people are looking to for information. They always have been, really. And so I think that the media has a personal responsibility to the public to make sure that they are coming from reputable sources.
Sure.
But they say like sex sells, that type of a thing. It's a pizzazzy story, and they're online, so they still have to move things forward. They haven't really been shut down. Reporters are still being reporters. And it's, as you can see, it gets really dangerous when a global pandemic becomes a political playground. It shouldn't be, and this comes from the media and our own politicians. It should not be about electability. It should not be about your pizzaziest story to get the next promotion or whatever. It should boil down to science. That's it. And that is everyone's personal responsibility. Is it backed by science? No. Then don't believe it and go find the science.
Right.
If it's available.
Yeah. I think for, I guess, a fun tangent, the reason why I like that story is because it shows how the media ran with something. And then in a beautiful tragic comedy arc,
Okay.
the woman had an investigation opened against her for homicide. And that's as of April 29th, and I can't find a single source updating it any further. So
well,
that's
I think the police
left.
system's a little busy right now.
Yeah, I'm sure they're busy, but none of the news agencies were providing anything other than that was just an interesting like arc of tragic comedy, But so I want to go back to masks because you understand particle size and the effective nature of masks, and so. What if I'm hiking and I see some people coming towards me?
Okay.
Should I even worry about like pulling up my mask? Like if I'm going to be 6 feet apart, we're outside, there's airflow, there's all these things. Is it worth carrying a mask and like getting hot because it's now averaging 60, 70 degrees? Is it worth it or is it not worth it?
I think it's absolutely worth it. I think that not only is it just a social thing to remind people that we are still in a pandemic. So I personally come from a really privileged area. We are sheltering in place in a really privileged area, and so there's less cases here. So you have that that paradox that the prevention paradox that I talked about, and so people are more lax about it. But as we discussed, that's how then things start spiraling out of control. Right. So do I think it's worth it? Absolutely. I have not been sick with COVID-19 as I understand it. I haven't been tested, but I don't believe I have. And so I'm still at risk. If you're saying, what's the probability of getting enough viral particles into your body when you're walking in an open aired area, you're right. You're definitely going to have a lower probability of infection if we're saying the same amount of viral particles are being released out in the woods as you walk by someone or at a grocery store aisle when you walk by someone.
Sure.
You have contained air or you have more quickly dispersing particles. But is it worth the risk? Is it worth the medical bills? Is it worth it's more than just, is it worth getting COVID? Is it worth spreading it? Is it worth even risking it? Is it worth your mental space? And
Sure.
Right now with the emotions so high, it's not worth my mental space. I'd rather the black and white, let's just do it. And then when I'm past the people, like 12 feet more, I take my mask and I pull it down.
Okay.
But the second I see someone coming, that goes back on my face.
Okay, that's fair. So the other thing, I guess, I see a lot of
not public places.
In public places, of course, I'm going to keep my mask on from the moment I leave my car, going to CVS, whatever. I'm going to keep my mask on. I leave the car, I put the mask on, leave the car, and then it doesn't come off until I get back in my vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many different types of masks we see, and then there's Amazon who's selling these like charcoal masks, or they have these pads of activated charcoal.
Let's just put a carcinogen right in our face. What could possibly happen? That's like
charcoal, like tooth
that's whitening. I'm like, oh my god.
If we've got an N95 and the like 3M masks, those are we could agree those are effective to the utmost degree that we could expect if we wanted to really stop inhalation of particles or exhalation of the particles.
The highest probability of stopping it. Right.
Now, where do we stand with everything short of that? So we've got like. There's instructions on how to use like microfiber towels and create like a barrier. Like, are viral particles really getting released through a mask that's like multiple layers of fabric, or even like
If
a
you have
single
one
layer?
layer versus, if you have one layer, it's going to get soaked faster than a few layers.
Soaked with,
Spit from breathing. How long have you had one of those masks on? By the time I pull down, I'm like, why is just this part of my face exfoliated?
like all
It's not. I know. I'm like,
humid.
oh god.
Yeah.
I'm acting like it's just here on my face. I'm like, fantastic.
But like, I guess my question is like, we're exhaling humid air with the virus on it, right?
Mm-hmm. But
Or
they're
somebody,
microparticles or nanoparticles of liquid.
right? So the nanoparticles is where we need to have an N95 or higher, I think is what we can agree.
Yeah, they're the
The
smallest
stuff,
particles that
right?
we
The stuff
can.
that has become aerosolized, where it's going to stay floating in the air for a significant amount of time. But like those other mask types, like I would never personally, I have the resources to use something that's multiple layers. Like I've seen people using a single layer bandana. Like why don't we, it's tough because I see so much advertisement on social media and on Amazon for these masks, and it is difficult for me to say ban these people because they're saying these false claims of, hey, these are great for the flu, or the, like, get out and enjoy quarantine or whatever, like in their marketing. And it's like,
Yeah,
but
it's part of
it's
selling.
not an N95 mask.
Right.
You're not advertising properly. Like, I guess, where do you stand on that? I don't know if you've seen some of that stuff out
Well,
there.
I mean, I work or my research is funded by food-related, um, food-focused grants and such, and
Okay.
especially with product development, part of the focus group is where's our target? What are we trying to do? Their goal is to sell this product. It is still a product. And so at the end of the day, money really doesn't seem to care if they're spreading false whatever. There are laws in place that should be protecting it, but our politicians are a little busy right now. So, but to your point, I think that they should be ashamed of themselves for spreading false information. It goes back to personal responsibility on an individual and a corporate and a global level, national global level, to do the right thing for outside yourself. When we wear a mask, it's not so that we're necessarily just protecting ourselves, because you're really not when you're wearing that surgical mask.
Yep.
It's trying to protect someone else if you are
Mhm.
sick and you don't know. So where do I stand on those companies? I think they should be ashamed of themselves. Where do I stand with masks that are not N95? Well, I think that they, if we have pooled all the resources of N95, they should first go into all of the first responders' hands. And if they are okay, we've got enough masks to last us through a year of this crap, then start disseminating it to people.
Okay.
But when it comes to bandanas and stuff like that, Alex, or your sister, found this article, and a few people have seen it, where a man who was African American who said that he didn't feel safe wearing a mask because of the social bias that comes around someone who is African American wearing a mask in public. And
Sure.
that is so unfortunate. But like, then we come back to, so we have social stigmas that are problems. We have people not believing because there's so much false information, a lack of trust. There's people who just don't care. So I would say, what do I feel about wearing those? I think you should. Do I think you should shame someone into not wearing them? No. But as my mother says, and she's a licensed therapist, she says, remain curious. And if someone is not doing something, don't shame them, ask them. So when you were going to your chiropractors, that made me really nervous, just because everything's making me nervous at this point.
Oh, I'm sure.
But
Yeah.
but then when Alex, your sister, couldn't handle her back hurting anymore, and she suited up and went, I mean, the office was doing a tip-top shape of like every type of precaution they could take. And so that to me is more reassuring. So
True.
I think that it's such a tricky line to walk through, but at this rate, it's remain curious. I asked your sister to explain to me what it looked like, and she explained what it looked like, and I in an instant was like, oh my god, I can't even believe that I felt so upset at Cameron or you're the fact that you were going, not at you.
Yeah, no, I
Just
totally
because
get what
of the
you're saying.
highs. So, but like my mom's point was, don't be upset. Figure out why. You're a smart dude. You're immunocompromised. You had to have done the research. You had to have thought about it. So that's hard to do when you're emotionally stressed. Really hard to do. And most people don't have the type of coping skills that they need, especially now.
Yeah, well, that's what I think is interesting. I think I go back to that. I mean, the original one before it
The
had this.
OG.
What?
The OG.
Yeah, the original version where it was saying that you should come out of this stronger, and I think that you should. There's a concept in the psychological world, which is exposure therapy. Is you expose yourself to something, and you will, as long as you dose it properly, you will become immune to that level of dosage. I'm not talking about the virus anymore. I hope that's very clear. I'm talking about specific things. So, for example,
behavioral things. Yeah.
behavioral things, physical things to some extent, like stresses. The reason why we go to the gym and lift a weight is so that we can incrementally lift more weight or more volume of that same weight. So I think that like a lot of people have realized that, and they've actually created an exposure therapy of their own. For example, my mother, who is now calmer each and every time she comes back from the store. The first time, it was literally like a level of a pre-panic attack level, like emotions I could sense. And then ever since then, it's just like I'm frustrated. The line was long. There's like 3 cash registers open. Like I couldn't find the meat that you guys wanted. Like all these things, and it's really interesting.
I'm a terrible mother. Yes, that's why you cook all our meals and clean.
But totally, it's like we've exposed ourselves so much, and when you extend the timeline for so long, we've exposed ourselves to these things. Like I feel like everybody should come out of this stronger, whether it be like, hey, let's like sit back and realize, hey, Instagram has told me I've been on for an hour today. Maybe I should like, close the app, turn off my phone. Maybe like you go out for a run. Like I know that with your back issues, walking is difficult for extended periods of time.
It's like uphill both ways.
Right. But like, is there a way for you or me or any of the people out there to like come out stronger? Like, I don't know.
You're going into definition of strength. So if I say someone who comes out of this at all, I'm a highly anxious person. I have been, as far as I understand it, my whole life. Okay. I also have really bad ADHD. And so part of that means is that when something like this happens at the beginning, it's just overwhelming because so many things are happening and changing and this and that, the other thing. So is it strong for me with a history of anxiety to come out of this accepting about what's happening and the restrictions or whatever? Or is it strong if I don't care? Because if your mom's, there's an annoying line and I don't think that this should still be here and blah, 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 because she's now falling into the prevention paradox. Is that strength or stupidity?
Oh, that's fair.
So, and the other thing is like, if I have had 7 traumas in my life, and this is one more, if I come out of this at all, being like, it's so not worth it, which I don't think people should feel, then the strength I would say is that I came out at all. But I don't think you need to come out with a blog or a manuscript in my case, which I will. I swear.
You will. You absolutely.
I will. Finally, yeah. But I think that coming out of this with the ability to figure out what is legitimate, giving yourself like forgiveness. I know it sounds so hippie, but this type of thing where you're like, I just couldn't do it. There's a difference between saying I set it up, I got to the hill, I was going to walk up it, and then I took 5 steps and my back hurt and I was like, it's not worth doing. I can't do it. But it took a lot of strength to get there.
Yeah, but then there's a lot of the people though that wouldn't even get into the car and go to the hill and like schlep themselves over
maybe
there.
They know even less. Maybe they read all this information. I mean, you had to do your marketing. You had to do a darn lot of research to be able to have a conversation on a sciencey side. If I were wanting to have a conversation with you about finances and money, I would need to do a lot more research than you would right now because you just have that experience.
Right. But
So
to that
they might
end,
not know how to read it. They might not even have access to reading it.
the access is different. I challenge that in that the internet is virtually free nowadays, and I think
If you have a computer.
the prevalence of smartphones, though. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have gotten my Chinese smartphone for a decent price, but this is a huge screen. I mean, most of my research and knowledge gathering is through my phone. I'm privileged. I have a laptop. I have 2 monitors here for my other computer. I have my work laptop. I have so many electronics in front of me, but the data is there and it's accessible. Like whether you have dial-up or you have high-speed internet, like I think now we're given enough time that I think everybody needs to like be their own researcher to know
If you
what.
can, but I also don't know the poverty offhand, those numbers. The other thing is that, I mean, look at
Mhm.
unemployment rate. It's at an all-time high. It's not that you can't, like maybe they have a smartphone, but maybe they can't afford Wi-Fi anymore. I'm a student from a privileged background
Mhm.
and I didn't get cable because I wanted to fund my wife's education instead.
Right, and I think
So, so it's like, could I have asked my parents
yeah,
for the money or something? Well, yeah.
totally. But I mean, like, do you need not you, obviously, but I think I'm putting this question out to people who might listen to this. I don't know if we're gonna get 100 listeners to this podcast
Thousand
or
at
5
least.
or tens of thousands. Who knows? Maybe
At
this is
least,
gonna blow up. But
obviously.
the prevalence in the U.S. We're 7th in the U.S. for smartphone penetration, which
Ew, don't
is
use that.
which is oh shit. Oh, okay, sorry. I'll bleep that. Um, the podcast
Start
just
with that.
the podcast just froze. But 69%, 69.3% have smartphones. So it's like now you've got tons of time. You have to have time. Like
Do
whether
you?
you are still working full time and now you don't have a commute, you can sleep more, or you can say, hey, I was getting adequate sleep. Let me spend a little bit of time and understand something new. Learn
Okay.
something. I didn't know the science of this stuff until I realized, hey, Emma knows a little bit more, and I'm gonna try to have an educated conversation. Like, let me like read up. And then I was like, all right, I have my biases, and I was a little bit wrong on a lot of this stuff. and then,
Honestly, I was too when I was looking up more things. Me too.
but then, like, I also think about like maybe the person who is just on their smartphone, they don't need to necessarily be entertained by a Netflix or an Amazon Prime. We know Amazon Prime isn't giving you 2-day delivery. What's the point of even having it? So you save $12 there. You save, I don't know, Netflix is $8. All of a sudden now you have enough for your data. And like now you can be going and walking around, going on your long walks and listening to podcasts and educating yourself. And I think that like the information and the data is more important. Like it gives you so much power to like not be anxious. Like if you're
How
not,
long did it take you to figure out how to find legitimate sources? Though we were been taught that all the way through our education system.
well, that's my issue is I'd rather have, I go back to censorship on the internet, and I have a huge problem with censoring people on any platform except for the most egregious things, like actually advocating for breaking, um, actually even like advocating for breaking a law is muddy because of states having different laws. But I think that like censoring any news outlet or any piece of information is dangerous because if we know that the majority of it is accurate, and there's going to be those conspiracy theorists, or there's going to be people intentionally giving out false information in order to do something to advocate for
To
their
sell a
own,
mask that won't
yeah, to
actually
sell their mask,
cure anything.
is like you're gonna, if you actually spend the time, you're gonna see enough repeating data that you're gonna get the multiple sources that have the same thing, and you're gonna get that one outlier, the 10 outliers, but you've seen 100 sources that you know, okay, with a decent amount of certainty, I can conclude X. And I want to like say that like I feel like people owe themselves the they owe it to themselves to spend the time and realize like you need to advocate for yourself and for the information. You can't just absorb what is hand delivered to you. The CNN, Fox, MSNBC, the front page of YouTube, like all the front page things that are just like there but at the click of a button are
If
probably
it's too easy, it's probably not very reliable.
exactly like the
Yeah.
research paper that gives you what you need when you're doing your research isn't right
Also,
there,
usually
right?
buried in science words that you're like, what's that?
Right, exactly. So it's usually not the mainstream initially until it becomes the mainstream. I mean, like Galileo, he was banished. It was put under house arrest back in the day because the Earth is not the center. It actually absorbs. It rotates around
It's
the
absorbed completely.
the
I'm like,
sun. Like
wow, that's incredible.
but to imagine if
Yeah.
we said let's, which we're doing, we're banishing people who have information, and then it turns out that information is later true. The one that I love is the Wuhan lab, the level 4 lab. That's why I asked you about levels of labs. Is
Yeah,
that
they
was actually
handle very serious agents.
right, but they're the only level 4 lab in that area,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like a few miles from the wet markets.
Mm-hmm.
And there's speculation that it was leaked. But then there was an article that was written back in early February, and I was like, I'm pretty sure with decent confidence that that's probably true. Just we draw some lines on a map and whatever, and we can draw a conclusion. Turns out that there's more and more evidence to that end that suggests that this is real, like that there was a
Suggest
leak of
that
some
it
sort.
came from the lab, or suggest that someone specifically tried to get the Chinese population sick from Wuhan?
So there's
I
evidence
mean,
to suggest that that lab had the virus and it somehow was exposed to people in the wet markets.
I personally wouldn't really be surprised by that. As I understand it right now, what they believe happened is that the virus actually came from an animal. So I wouldn't be surprised. It's totally possible that it was in that lab and came, but then again, we in the United States have Ebola in a lab.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So that's, I don't want to emphasize that as being, whoa, that's really sketchy or what have you, because we also do it. We just didn't have an outbreak come from our country. So that's why we're not really talking about it on our end. As I understand it, they're thinking that it came from bats, that the original reservoir came in bats. And that's pretty common. Rabies comes from bats. They don't think that it went right from bats to humans. They actually think that in the wet market, it's from this like little tiny bat. In the wet market, they think it bit some of the animals that have been found there in the illegal trading market that are not allowed trafficking, like animal trafficking, like yeah, exactly. And so they think that it then morphed so that it basically couldn't get back into bats, but now it was filtering through this different reservoir, and that was a closer, when it jumped from that intermediate animal, then it jumped into us. But they think it's coming from animals into humans, because that is the majority of viruses that have been outbreaks of any kind have come from an animal to human transmission. Triple E, Ebola came from monkeys.
I mean, AIDS. There's speculation that AIDS was originally SIV, which is simian immuno.
Yeah. And that's not unexpected. There are bacterial diseases as well that you can get, that your parrot will get, and that you can then get.
Your parrot, like the animal?
Yeah, like a bird. Yeah. So it's dangerous. It's like you have to be really immunocompromised to get it, but it's you can look it up if you're like parrot fever.
Well, cats. The one you shouldn't have as a pregnant woman, you shouldn't have cats, right? Or you shouldn't handle their feces.
Correct. Yeah. There's oh crap, what's it called? Not typhimurium. It'll come to me.
But to that end, it's this whole idea that the virus came from a bat or a lab or wherever it came from, and then it jumped to humans or adapted to humans, or it evolved to handle the host of a human, is basically verifiable in the fact that it's happened before.
Well, multiple times. Right. In fact, believe almost all times that we have of these huge outbreaks across humans has been coming from an animal vector. And an animal vector, mind you, I also want to define what that means. It doesn't mean that the bats were really sick and then the pangolins, I'm not sure how you say that. Yeah, which I looked up, and they are very cute. They are very cute. I was like,
they're anteaters with scales.
They're so cute.
But they eat them, which is so sad. But anyhow, you were about to say, you want to define it.
But so it's not that they were sick or showing symptoms or anything. It's that it was able to mutate there and then get into the host that it actually was able to make more of itself in. So persistence and then spreading versus actually making more of yourself and shedding elsewhere.
So the pangolin was just a carrier of some sort.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Cool. Well, I think that this is time to close out. Do you have any like final words regarding your area of expertise? Anything you might want to share with our massive audience?
Of 25,000 people.
Of course. The many people that are listening, right. All 4 of them.
Of course. Your grandma, your mom, my mom.
No, but do you have anything that you want to share with anybody? Maybe your social handle. I mean, I'm going to link your LinkedIn. I think that's probably the best way to get a hold of you.
Yeah, LinkedIn, or I'll also give my Cornell address as well, so people can reach out if they want to.
Okay.
I would say that my closing factor would be kind to yourself. I know it sounds really silly, but be kind to yourself and try and wear a mask, do social distancing, try and remember that this is not forever. And if you need help, reach out. If you have questions, reach out, especially to universities. You'd be surprised how many people will respond to your emails because they have to pay attention to their emails now.
All right. Thanks, Emma.
I hope you enjoyed the first episode of my podcast with Emma Farquharson. I hope that if you found this information valuable, you'll share it with a friend or share it with somebody who you think could get something out of it. And if you enjoyed it, please give it a like. And I hope that you'll stick around for the future episodes that'll be coming out very soon.